You've taught your teams to inspect, adapt. Every 2 weeks we're going to look at things that are going right or wrong. Your sprints are humming along. Your retrospectives are generating, real improvements. So why does it still take 6 months to get materials from suppliers? Why can't the rest of our organization learn to produce their work as fast as our development teams? So here's the brutal truth. Your Scrum teams are really only as agile as the slowest learning loop in the entire value stream. And right now, that loop is probably your supply chain. Hi, I'm Lance Dacy, otherwise known as Big Agile, and today we're going to walk through how companies like Schneider Electric and P&G are teaching their supply chains to learn at the speed of Scrum. Not necessarily by, copying the ceremonies, but by understanding the system principles that I find make Agile work just about anywhere, regardless of the type of work. So we're going to cover 3 key areas that I see a lot of organizations struggle with this. And so we're going to talk about why supply chains needs learning systems even more than our software teams do. We're going to learn how to map the constraints as learning opportunities, not necessarily just problems to solve. And I would actually like to show you some real companies that have had this problem before and redesigned their supply chain networks using Agile principles that we're fairly familiar with. And I'd like to show some of the numbers that actually proved to them that it worked. So why is it that supply chains can't just go agile? That's the big question. And there's a lot of reasons. The supply chain is just one example, by the way, but I just started to hit on this because I had a client struggle with this. But I'd like to address the elephant in the room. If you're a Scrum Master, Agile coach, or something like that, you've probably thought, if Scrum works for software, why doesn't supply chain or finance or, IT infrastructure, whatever, why don't they just adopt it? And I hear this all the time. And so I'd like to kind of level set a little bit and say, here's why it's a little bit harder. So let's just first talk about tooling, maybe the only thing that we really need to talk about. Software teams can deploy daily, hourly, minutely in some cases, while, we tend to see that supply chain decisions have, maybe 6 to 12 week lead times. So you can't just pivot when materials are already on a ship, from China. Software, we used to have those problems a long time ago, but our tools make it easier and easier to deploy if we build processes around that. And I can't get a ship from China to the USA with any better technology than what we have yet. I know it's coming, but software, we find that, product development teams, they can change direction, with a backlog refinement session. The code rewrite's fully expungible, while the supply chain or any other type of, we've got similar types like supply chain in the org. I'm not just trying to pick on supply chain, but they have, binding contracts. They have capital investments. They have commitments that just can't be unwound without a significant cost. And I can hear you right now saying, well, we have contracts, we have capital investment and commitments in software, but we can usually pivot and change directions a little bit easier without significant costs. There's cost to the waste, but it's not like hard costs that you have in the supply chain. So we talk about, software bugs can get fixed in the next sprint. Supply chain bugs or mistakes, they ripple through the whole system for quarters. And when you order, the wrong components, you're kind of stuck with them. You got the refund and the replacement process. But, and like I said, I'm not just picking on supply chain. There's many parts of the org that are like that. I love supply chain because I worked at FedEx Express for 10 years. I got a signed hat from Frederick W. Smith. And this is October of 1997. We opened the 3rd largest air hub in Fort Worth. So I really bleed purple and orange. I love FedEx, UPS, all of you out there. And so I really get the supply chain problems. And I really believe that FedEx taught me a lot on how to be efficient amidst chaos. There's some things you can plan for, some things you can't plan for. So I do have insight into some of these logistical constraints when it comes to supply chain. So when we hear supply chain leaders, or when we see, supply chain leaders that we're kind of calling out in the organization, when they hear the word, hey, let's go agile, I'd like to kind of preface that with what they think you're saying. And so when they hear, throw away your forecasts and just react, a lot of executives think that as well. What you really mean is shorten your planning cycles to match your learning cycles. That's really what we're saying. But they hear other things. When they hear stop optimizing for cost, which is what they've been trained all their life, what we're really meaning is optimize for throughput through the constraint, not a local efficiency. We've seen it in, software teams all the time where, we're trying to optimize for the local problem and local team or local skill set. And in reality, that's really sub-optimizing. We want to optimize for the whole. So sometimes supply chain can hear that as well. They might hear us say, embrace chaos. What we really mean is build feedback loops that let you sense and respond faster than the market's shift. And we've kind of learned how to do that in product development. So, we've been talking for the last week or so about how to get other parts of the organization to adopt some of these practices. And I think the key insight is that's exactly why supply chains need learning systems even more than software does, because the feedback loops are longer. So the cost of learning is slowly catastrophic and not as quick. So it's even more of an argument of why we need to go that route. So think about what happened in the early 2020s. I just produced a video last week where we talked about the global pandemic of me being in Hawaii in February of 2020 and all that happening. But going back to that, global ports around the world stalled. Raw materials were sitting idle on ships and, abroad. Organizations with lean, efficient supply chains actually collapsed because they had optimized for cost and removed all of their slack in the system because they thought that's what efficiency was. They really didn't have any learning loops, no centers, and no ability to adapt. They had streamlined that. And that's what we learned, in business school. We're trained to find the single right plan and then execute it and optimize for the inefficiencies that are happening. But what we find is as we learn through these problems, we can, understand them a little bit better. And so I find that companies that survived all of that, it's not that they had better forecasts, they had shorter feedback loops. They were able to adapt and learn amidst all the uncertainty that was going on. And so what I would like to kind of showcase there is what y'all typically are used to seeing on this diagram is a traditional supply chain that's more of a, what we would call more of like a waterfall or a Gantt chart looking thing. And you've got, annual contracts. You got to prepare the contracts. You do quarterly payment. You do payments and procurement and, shipping and validation and all those kind of things. And so what happens is we tend to structure our processes around this typical supply chain activity. But what we're trying to do with Agile, putting those Agile feedback loops in, is more of a circular network. So, the learning system is rolling, planning, weekly retrospectives, daily visibility is really what we're looking for. And so we're trying to shift them as well from that traditional, waterfall mindset to more of a looping. And sometimes they think of it like a roller coaster like this as well. So I'd like to talk about the constraints. I've done a lot of work on how Scrum has enabling constraints. So let's talk about constraints as teachers. And so what I'd like to do is connect this to something you already know. Likely in your retrospectives, you identify an impediment. You don't just try to remove it. You identify it. And you ask, what is this impediment teaching us about the system? And probably another question, if I'm your coach, is this the biggest problem to solve? Like, is this got the biggest bang for the buck? In Agile, we're typically looking for the highest value delivery item with the least amount of cost. So when you're making improvements in a complex adaptive system, you have to be really picky about the changes you make, because you might change something really small somewhere and it affects something you didn't even think about. So I think the same principle is going to apply to supply chain constraints. And I'm a big fan of Donald Reinertson and his book on the principles of product development flow. Pretty challenging read, but I love how he says in there the goal really isn't efficiency. That's kind of the byproduct. Really, what the goal is learning under the uncertainty. So every constraint that we have in a supply network is a teacher. And the question isn't like, how do we eliminate that constraint? It's like, what is that constraint trying to teach us about the overall system? And so then we can dive into, Eli Schragenheim and talk about the theory of constraints perspective. He would say something like every system has, one point that governs its throughput. So once you find that, you design your learning loops around that one single throughput that seems to be governing everything. And so I find in Agile product development, we're familiar with this. We just call it the inspect and adapt. I think in supply networks, it would be more maybe like a sense and respond. That's kind of the same problem we have that we're trying to do in software development, but that same principle is just a different context. And so what I'd like to showcase, when we're talking about that inspect and adapt cycle is what does that really look like in the supply chain? So I kind of think of a value stream. You have visible bottlenecks, you have arrows that are feeding data back upstream. But really what that looks like is we're going to detect a constraint, we're going to learn from it, we're going to adapt our flow and measure the impact. And I think that's more of like that sense and flow analogy that I was just talking about, building the metrics in there to do that. And I find, where this gets a little bit more practical is where a company called Schneider Electric was actually facing semiconductor shortages. We've heard about that in the news a lot as well. And they didn't just try to find more chips. It's like, oh my gosh, our business is failing. We need to find more chips. They asked, what is this constraint teaching us about our own system? And they can learn from that and evolve and adapt and have what we like to call in FedEx contingency plans for that. So the constraint taught them that their planning cycles were really too slow. They were running quarterly reviews while the market might be having a shift every week. So they changed their learning cadence to match that. And they built what they called a control tower model. Almost like you could think of at an airport. But here's what matters about that. It wasn't really the technology, it was the ceremonies. So we talk about Scrum a lot of times. Why don't you just implement Scrum? It's all about the ceremonies. Well, the ceremonies are just kind of like the byproduct. Those ceremonies or those events are instituted for a specific reason. And so we find that, weekly flow retrospectives instead of quarterly reviews, each site uses process behavior charts to, detect those abnormal variations. So when I go back and talk about the metrics, it's all about these behavior charts, which we've talked about before in our blogs. But we're trying to detect that variation, before it becomes a crisis. And so cross-functional teams think of them as, think of those as like a scrum of scrums or something. You decide daily reallocations of constrained parts. And this is more about a team of team type scenario. So I was thinking through what a network diagram might look like for a bunch of teams, showing how we would plan, source, make, and deliver, and then learn. That's kind of the nomenclature we would use in the supply chain, and how feedback loops at every stage of that between the teams and the seams of the teams would help us get better and be more agile at that. So the actual result of what happened here with this organization, with the control tower model, is they had a result that gave us 91% customer order fulfillment during shortages, while their competitors in the same industry were well below 70%. And so what I want to showcase here is their secret wasn't, resilience in the market. It was a response speed that was built through shorter learning cycles, which they called the control tower model. So I want you to notice what they did here is they basically took Agile principles as we know it, or even in Scrum, we call them the sprint reviews, the retrospectives, the daily Scrums, And they basically applied that to the constraint. They didn't really copy the ceremonies. They didn't call it Scrum necessarily, but they understood the system principle and shortened the distance between action and learning. And at the end of the day, that is really what we're trying to do there. So I want to focus, as far as Agile is concerned, regardless of the space you're working in, is the feedback loops are basically the nervous system of what we're trying to accomplish here. So think of your supply chain as an organism, really. It's not a machine, it's an organism. It has sensors. That's like your inventory data. It has muscles. That's your logistics, right? It has a brain. That's your decision-making models. But without a nervous system, without feedback loops, we really can't learn. And so what I want to showcase here, we all know data and metrics are usually good to have. I'm not afraid of metrics at all, by the way. I'm afraid of how metrics are used. But if we're using metrics for learning and not performance necessarily, then they can really help us with that. And so we have like metrics and process behavior charts. Those basically create the conditions for continuous learning. We're evaluating them. We don't overreact to the data, by the way. So that's why process behavior charts are important, because it starts desensitizing us to the normal ebb and flows of the business and helps us really say, is there a change in the system or not? So these process behavior charts create a condition for continuous learning once you learn how to use them. And you can't fix what you can't talk about, or you only measure after it breaks. That's more of a lagging indicator. That's not very helpful as well. So Amazon does a great job of this with their metrics, and they can sense when something's amiss in their whole network just based on looking at metrics every day. So I find when you introduce real-time feedback loops or demand signals, lead time variability charts, throughput trends, there's a lot of metrics we could track. You move from forecasting to adapting. You stop chasing the lagging indicators or the lagging metrics, and you start navigating reality. And that is real-time visibility into your system. So I'd like to give you 3 more examples of companies that built these nervous systems. Some of them you may have heard of, and some of them maybe not. But Flex is a company that built a digital twin of its global network. Every supplier, plant, and logistics lane. They had them feeding live data into a shared model, a data model. But here's really what matters is they've run 2-week sprints that are focused on throughput experiments, not KPIs. So they had local plants kind of test out these small changes in small batch size to allow for those adjustments and supplier alternates and successful patterns. And what they were trying to do is get a scaled system-wide approach to this. And the result that they had was a 43% reduction in lead time variance within a year. P&G did something similar, even more radical, is they retrained their suppliers to work in agile cycles through what they call collaborative planning sprints. So what that actually means is in sprint planning, what is the one constraint that we can improve this sprint? So it's really not about a sprint delivering something, it's a sprint delivering improvements. And their daily scrums were more about, hey, what's blocking flow today? The sprint reviews were more about, did we actually improve throughput? And then we have the retrospectives, talking about what did we learn about this constraint. And so they took suppliers who had, never heard of Agile before, as it's applied to more of our product development teams for sure. And they taught them how to work in sprints. And not because it's trendy, we don't want to do it because of that, but because it's the alternative was, these quarterly planning cycles while, they were experiencing demand shifts every week. So what I thought was really cool about this is they have 2 teams on either side of a whiteboard here kind of sharing a sprint goal. We see the power of that through scaling Scrum just in product development. But that shared sprint goal was a throughput, improvement. That's what they were looking for. And what they ended up finding as a result of doing some of these activities was a 32% reduction in order to delivery lead time in just about 6 months. And that wasn't, because they optimized their supply chain. That was because they taught their supply chain to learn what's the metrics, what's the things that we want to look at daily. And that is what the sprint was modeled after. Maersk did something similar for that for a supply chain. What many agile teams are still trying to do in software is they stopped measuring, the activities and started measuring flow. And flow is one of those key indicators. We know this in product development as well. It's not how busy the people are or how busy the port is for Maersk. It's how fast does value move through the system. It's not a cost per container item for them, but a cash to cash cycle time. So it's radically different metrics than what we're used to looking at when we, grow up as leaders and managers and talk about you can't manage what you can't measure and all that management dogma that we learn. And so they're actually really trying to challenge the new metrics that we track. So it's not utilization, but throughput dollars per constraint hour. And so that sounds familiar to us because throughput accounting is another way to kind of look at this. And agile metrics are solving the same problem. How do you measure a system's health when the goal is learning and flow, not resource utilization or efficiency? So I'd like to wrap up here, talking about the pattern. What is the pattern that connects all of this? And I want you to notice what all of these companies share is they didn't start by redesigning their entire supply network, agile transformation. They started redesigning how fast they could learn. And they were using these agile events and ceremonies to do that, the principles. And so the pattern we can talk about is cadence before technology. Learning rhythm matters way more than all of the dashboards. So let's put that rhythm in place. Schneider Electric's weekly retrospectives beat any of the AI forecasting tools that they had. In fact, any company can have that. So how are you going to be hyper competitive is learning. So cross-boundary retrospectives reflection includes not only, suppliers and partners, but also the internal teams. And P&G, brought those suppliers into sprint planning and had those dual goals. So economic flow metrics, measure the throughput and the learning speed, not just the cost alone. And Maersk focused on the cash to cash cycle time. So we're empowering local teams, decentralizing, decision making, but centralized visibility. That's an important distinction there. And we want flex. Like flex, we were talking about, let the local plants experiment within the boundaries. We let them self-organize and be autonomous around that. So they didn't get there by restructuring their supply chain. They changed their relationship with learning, and all of those involved were focused on that. So I'd like to show you one last example that drives this home. And so Patagonia is a company that built resilience through intentional slack. So we've heard that word slack before in flow economics, and dual suppliers per critical material. They were having a lot of issues with that. And transparently, they shared platforms and did ongoing Kaizen weeks upon weeks with cross-supplier teams. Now, we often think, finance teams hate this kind of stuff. They see slack as waste. But the economic argument is that slack really isn't waste, it's optionality. And that's a hard word to really get past for some of these terms. So when Patagonia's dual suppliers gave them, flexibility during disruptions, what was the value? How do you put an ROI on that? Well, their competitors faced, stockouts and lost customers, but Patagonia kept thriving because of that slack. So even though it may not look like a cost savings initially when you talk about slack, it ends up being that in the long term. And that's what the problem is with most corporations these days, very short-term decisions. So the cost of slack was maybe 5% higher supplier cost, but the cost of stockouts for their competitors was easily 30 to 40% of their revenue loss during that disruption. So that's not waste, that's insurance, that pays for itself. Nobody likes to pay insurance, but when we need it, we like paying for it. So this is where the theory of constraints can meet agile thinking. You don't optimize every part of the system. You optimize throughput through the constraint. And sometimes that means intentionally building in slack everywhere except the constraint. And so it's one of those learning lessons that I like to use with real organizations, and we can talk about what this actually means for you. What can we actually do about it? And so I'd like to bring this back to your world and wrap us up. You're a Scrum Master. You're an agile coach. You're a product person trying to deliver value faster, but you keep hitting this wall. Supply chain can't keep up, finance can't keep up, whatever it might be. Materials that you're trying to ship arrive late. Procurement cycles take months. Your sprint reviews, may show working software or product, but customers can't get the physical product out, or they can't get access to this. So I find what I try to help and train coaches to do is, and here's what you need to understand, is that your Scrum teams are only as agile as that slowest learning loop in the value system. And that loop probably spans functions that you or your teams, don't control. So, like we discussed last week, we were talking about all the different parts of the organization. You can't make your sprints faster if finance still runs these annual budget cycles, and you can't deliver value continuously if operations, still batch deployments quarterly. We talked about that as well, and you can't adapt, to changing customer needs if your supply chains, plan in 12-month horizons. So what I think of, the enterprise agility and why it's so hard is because it's not about scaling Scrum. It's about redesigning the learning loops across your entire value stream. And that's something rarely anybody is talking about. They're going to say, what is a learning loop? So I find what we can actually do to help with this is to start with visibility. In your next sprint, review and invite someone from supply chain or procurement or wherever you're experiencing an issue, and show them what you're learning every few weeks. Ask them how long their learning cycles are. And you're just trying to create awareness and inviting them and desensitizing them to that. Then I like to think about, mapping out the constraint. Where does value sit waiting in your system? Is it procurement approvals? Is it material lead times? Is it deployment windows? Use your retrospectives to identify those constraints which are outside of your team's control. There's a lot of times we can't go fix those, but our Scrum Masters or Agile coaches can work to facilitate those removals. Then I like to propose an experiment. Don't try to change the whole system. Pick one of those constraints, propose one small experiment. And, what if we ran a weekly checkpoint instead of a monthly review? So maybe just for this one supplier or just for this one sprint. Experimenting is a very important part of the work we do in Agile. And then I like to teach them the language. So when you talk to a supply chain, don't say go agile. That doesn't really mean anything to them. So, that's in our industry of product development. They don't really have that in supply chain for sure. So what you want to say is, let's shorten the feedback loop. I tend to think agile really just replace that with, we're trying to deliver high value as early as possible with the least amount of cost. So don't say the word agile, just say it's very hard to argue that that's the right way to work. So is it a bad thing to shorten the feedback loop? Don't say embrace uncertainty. That's not really what they're trained to do. Say, hey, let's build some sensors that detect problems earlier. So you're just kind of replacing the language, and it's hard to mature as a coach. So at the end of the day, measure flow, not activity. Help other functions see that utilization isn't the goal. Throughput is the goal. A busy system with these massive queues in a slow system is not what we're looking for. An idle system with fast flow is a valuable system, And so the truth about most agile transformations is you really can't create an agile organization simply by transitioning IT and then hoping other functions follow. You have to help those functions redesign their own learning systems and use some of the language that helps them do that. And that all starts with understanding their constraints, not just yours. You want to speak their language. You want to show them that the principles that actually make Scrum and Agile work in our environment are short cycles, fast feedback, and empirical process control. Those things can work everywhere. So just a reminder that Gerald Weinberg or even Einstein said in the introduction to general systems thinking, they said that significant problems cannot be solved at the same level of thinking that actually created them. So linear optimization can't solve complex network problems. And the companies that survived the past decades of chaos, 9/11, 2008 financial crisis, the 2020 pandemic, the semiconductor shortages, the port disruptions, they didn't have the best forecast. They had the shortest feedback loops. So my challenge as a helper, agile consultant, agile coach in the industry, is stop thinking supply chain optimization. We hear that word a lot. Start thinking supply network learning. Maybe that's a better way to look at it. So when your system can see itself, when data, teams, and feedback loops are connected, it can anticipate disruption long before it hits, or at least minimally as it's hitting, and not being more of a reactionary thing. We can kind of try to plan for it. And so when it can adapt faster than the market shifts, then your resilience becomes your competitive advantage. And that's what we're trying to do. So don't ask, how efficient is our supply chain? Ask, how fast can our supply chain learn? All right. So what we're looking for is speed of learning. Efficiency is much better. Speed of learning is much better than the efficiency of execution. So this week, I want you to try something. Find one person in your organization who touches a supply chain, procurement, finance, or whatever, operations, and ask them this question. Okay. You're going to say, how long is the feedback loop between when you make a decision and when you know that that decision worked? We talk about computational irreducibility a lot. We don't know it works until it works. So how do they know? Then ask them, what would they have to do to change, or what would they have to change for that loop to be half as long? Okay. You're not trying to fix their supply chain. You're trying to introduce the concept of learning cycles. And that's how transformation starts. Not with necessarily an initiative and a kickoff and a project and all this kind of stuff. It starts with conversations at the lower level and a feedback loop. So you can't make your system smarter by adding more rules. You can make it smarter by shortening the distance between action and learning. And that's our message for today. So if this resonates with you, please hit the like and subscribe, share it with other people. We are doing a weekly series where we kick it off with a YouTube video, and then we'll dive into our email newsletter to give you more meat and potatoes, as I like to say. And then we'll do a blog post and then a Friday LinkedIn newsletter. And I'd love to hear comments. What are the things that are blocking you right now? And that's what we do at Big Agiles. We help leaders create organizations where agility is the operating system, not just what our developers do. So change is hard, but you don't have to do it alone. Give us a like or subscribe. Give us a comment. We hope to hear from you this week.